Good to see everybody. We are ready to study from Matthew 19 tonight. And one of the things about this section, this period in Jesus' life, is that for the most part, we've been sticking in Luke and John because they record some things that Matthew and Mark don't have for us. Tonight is a little different because we're going to go somewhere that Matthew and Mark have recorded that we don't get as much on in Luke and John. Luke does mention some of Jesus' instruction on marriage and divorce, but not, I think it's one verse, Luke 16, verse 18. I think that's about it, and not in this setting. And so let me just remind you of the setting that we're in when we come to Matthew chapter 19. Jesus is in the land of Perea, and the word Perea just means beyond. And so he is beyond the Jordan River. And so when we come to Matthew 19, we're getting pretty close to the conclusion of Jesus' earthly ministry, because what's going to happen is that he's going to come back across the Jordan River. We'll see this, Lord willing, in the next couple of lessons. When he gives sight to the blind man, he's going to pass through Jericho, which is basically the next city before you get to the outskirts of Jerusalem. And he'll never pass back through there again. That will be the end of it. And then chapter 21 of Matthew is the triumphal entry. The end of Luke 19, triumphal entry. Mark 11, John 12. All of those passages put us in the last period of Jesus' life during that final week. And so we're really just right on the precipice of all of that. Now, with all of that in mind, I think it kind of helps set the context for some of the things that Jesus is going to deal with in chapters 19 and 20. Tonight, we have a challenge, but I would say a privilege, because we're only focusing on a few verses, but there's a lot that we need to make sure that we say and that we know about this. And I take it to be that this is one, I would say, of the most challenging things to talk about, given our culture and even given our own experiences with our own families or with ourselves. It creates lots of challenges to talk about. I will talk more about this Sunday, not about this subject. But one of the things that we have committed to is that we want to be faithful to God's word even where it hurts. And so I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want anybody. But I think about what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says, I didn't even want to write this letter because I didn't want you to be upset. And then you were upset. But now I'm rejoicing because you turned and you're doing what's right. And this is one of those things where it's like you almost don't want to talk about it, but you do want to talk about it because you want people to be in right standing with the Lord. And so that's why we have these kind of discussions. And hopefully in a lot of ways, we're able to say these truths now just so that we get them anchored deep, so that we get them set in place. And then when questions arise, so be it. There will be questions along the way. But what we want is we want some of these things set in stone for sure, so that at least we have a basis upon which we're answering those questions when they come up. Anything you want to say introductorily?
I just think, like you said, that when you study stuff like this and there's other topics, you have to look at yourself and say, do I want to follow the Lord? Do I want to follow Christ? And he tells us numerous times that to follow him is to obey him. If you love him, you obey him. So when we study stuff like this, I don't think it's hard to understand. I think it's just hard to accept, as you talked about with our culture and things. But if we're going to follow God, if we're going to follow Christ, then we got to take these teachings and accept them. We can't pick and choose and say, yes, Jesus is my Savior. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to dedicate my life to him, but I'm going to avoid that section because it kind of affects me or my family or friends or coworkers. We don't get to choose that.
Yeah. So one thing that I would say is I think that maybe one of the biggest controversies in our time is ideas about marriage, and maybe we would just say sexuality overall. And I think right now people like churches like this or in areas like this are really zoned in talking about homosexual marriage or whatever it might be. And yet I think that the problems that we have with marriage now are rooted in a long time of not valuing marriage for the way it's supposed to be. And I don't know how long it's been, but I would say probably within some of our lifetimes, marriage and divorce was just not acceptable in the way that it is now. But that's changed a lot. And, I think sometimes we look at one political side and say, well, it's their fault where marriage is. But can I say something? So, like, I look back at Ronald Reagan. I used to wear a Reagan Bush t-shirt all the time because I thought that was so cool. He was the first president to pass a law when he was governor of California that was a without fault divorce law in California. So, like, we talk about one political side when it comes to marriage, and, like, I think if we looked at our culture, I think we would say just about everybody has jumped the ship on what real marriage is supposed to look like. And then other things like you can read, so the Methodist church disciplines, it's amazing if you could go through and look at them from the late 1800s until the 1980s and how they change. It's completely, like 1880 or something, their Methodist discipline is saying exactly what Matthew 19 is going to say. And then by 1980, it's saying exactly what the culture would like for people to say about it. And so, we just have to be careful in following what the world is saying about divorce. And I think what that starts with is saying some things about marriage that have to be put in the right place, in the right foundation, so that we don't have to worry about that if possible. But of course, we've got to answer those questions as they come along. Anything else you want to say in an introductory way? Anybody have anything they want to say? So nobody texts me any questions, so thank you for your silence, because that's exactly what that's what I expect tonight. Just amens and agreements, no questions, because no, I will try to take those in the best way that we can tonight. So why don't we just go ahead and read, and I'm going to start in verse 3, and we'll read through verse 12. And some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read, he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." Let's actually just pause right there for a bit. Those last few verses are certainly relevant, but we'll talk about them more in a minute. Okay, so as we get started, who's coming and asking this question? Pharisees. Are they asking it with pure motives? No, they're testing him. And if I understand correctly, their question here is if they can divorce for any cause, reflected a debate that was going on at the time. In fact, I'm sure that it's a debate that's always been among God's people, is what are the proper terms for divorce. And as best I understand, there were basically two schools of thought in Jewish communities. There was one side that said divorce was allowed for any reason, and another side that said that divorce was allowed only for the cause of fornication. Now, in Deuteronomy 24, and we're going to come back to this passage, but this is about the only regulation that we have regarding divorce. There are other things said about divorce. Malachi chapter 2, God hates divorce, things like that. But this is the only specific passage that addresses the matter of divorce regulation, as best I know, in the Old Testament. There may be other passages, but this is the key one. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, why don't we just read that number, if I can find the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 24. I'm going to read verses 1 through 4, and we're going to come back to this, but I just want you to see what the argument was over. So this is 24 verse 1. If a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she goes out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahweh your God gives you as an inheritance. Now, we'll say, I have more to say about that verse because I really think that the Pharisees are misunderstanding what the verse is saying in general. And I think sometimes when we're trying to understand what Jesus says, I think we might misunderstand what he's saying. So I want to be careful with that. But the indecency there. If she doesn't find favor, and he finds some indecency in there. So there were some religious conservatives who would say that indecency can only be fornication, right? Sexual immorality. And there were some people who were saying it can be anything, and he is allowed to put her away. So they come to Jesus and they're asking him that question. It doesn't seem to me that they genuinely want an answer, but they want to put him against one side or the other, right? Put him in the conservative camp so the liberals, I don't know if they would have called themselves liberal, put him in the only for fornication camp so that the people who say any reason don't like him, or put him in the only for any reason camp so that the ones who say it's just fornication don't like him. And I would take it to be that the Pharisees are probably mostly in the only for the cause of fornication, given that they are what you would imagine as religious conservatives in the way that they approach things. But they ask Jesus this question. They're testing him, but Jesus' answer is really significant because he doesn't just address the debate, he addresses what's underneath the debate. And that's the beautiful thing about the way Jesus answers questions, is they will raise questions, and they might be all right questions, but they got bad motives. And Jesus answers them because he's trying to get right to the heart of things. And so we can learn about something from Jesus' answer, even if the question is being asked with bad motives. Anything through there?
One thing I got is in chapter 5, 31 and 32, he says these same exact words, talking about marriage, and his answer is exactly the same. So when they come testing him, maybe they're trying to get him to come back on something he had said earlier or something, but his answer is the same in both situations.
Yeah.
Chapter 5 and 19.
That's great. And I think 5 is a great example. So I was thinking about this as I was explaining that earlier. Jesus in Matthew 5:31 says, now it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Is that what Deuteronomy 24 said? Yes. But was that the point of Deuteronomy 24, to encourage men to give their wives a certificate of divorce? No, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, because the way the Pharisees frame it is wrong, I believe. And I think that is rooted kind of in what Jesus says here in Matthew 5:31, because he's saying you might have read the letters of the law, but you missed the point. And I don't think he's saying there was some secret meaning you didn't understand. I think he's saying you just didn't read it with an attitude of wanting to obey. You read it with an attitude of, how can I get around this? Just like they did all the other things, right? Lust and anger and lying and oath-telling and all of that. So Jesus will say exactly the same word about divorce, and he will say about the exception as well. Anything about their question in verse 3? So really what they're saying, they're asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce for any reason at all? And Jesus is going to respond to that. Okay? So what's Jesus' answer if we just summarized it? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? No, that's the answer. Very good. Now, he's going to give some pieces of evidence. As you read through, especially verses 4 through 6, and you could even go down further than that, what's the evidence that Jesus points to that it is not lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? What evidence does Jesus point to? God did what? God set it up in a specific way. What did you say? God's plan. All right. And where does he find that? Creation, basically, right? Genesis chapter 2. So he talks about the fact that the one who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined. Your text, does the English Standard say hold fast? Should be hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So Jesus, before addressing the answer to their question, actually defines what marriage is supposed to be like. Do you see that? He doesn't answer. Like I have no up there with an exclamation point. But he doesn't say, no, that's not lawful. What he does is he said, haven't you read what the Bible says about marriage? Haven't you read what God did at the beginning? He made them male, female, told the man to leave his father and mother, cleave, hold fast to, be joined to his wife, because they become one flesh, right? They are unified in that. So that, verse 6, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So Jesus here, it doesn't go back to Deuteronomy 24. I think that's where the arguments probably were all about, was Deuteronomy 24. And Jesus doesn't go back there. He goes all the way back to page 2, right? That's pretty early on. He goes back to page 2 and says what God did in the beginning was made male and female so that they would be joined, hold fast to one another. They'd be one flesh. And then this is Jesus' commentary about that. This is not quoting. This is him saying, what God has joined together, what God has made one flesh, let no man separate. Let no man pull apart. Don't render that asunder. Okay. You have anything so far?
Before we move on from that verse, just think about all the things that we deal with in our society today. This one verse tears majority of that down.
Mm-hmm.
He created male and female. So there is no these extra genders or these, people being born as, whatever animal they think. It's male and female. It talks about a husband and his wife. Nowhere does it say husband and husband, wife and wife. And it talks about two people. So this thing about having multiple wives, all these things that we face in society, this one verse completely does it away. Mm-hmm. But we have to go back to that. If we say that we're going to follow Jesus, we have to take his word as truth and go by that. And that's where the problem is. It's pretty simple to understand.
That's right.
Male, female, husband, wife, two people.
Mm-hmm.
And, he answers more questions as we go. But that one verse kind of throws a lot of our society's thinking right away with just one verse.
That's right. And let me say this. I think that Jesus helps us here. He always helps us. But in how we read the Old Testament and how we read the Bible. So if you're reading through Genesis chapter 2, the account is of Adam and Eve being joined together. And then in verse 24 of Genesis 2, it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. It seems like that verse refers to Adam and Eve specifically. But how do we know that there's a larger principle at work there? How do we know that they are just a preview of all the other marriages the way they're supposed to be? One, because Jesus referenced it and says this is the way it is. But two, Adam didn't have a mother and father to leave, right? So when it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, that's Moses writing by inspiration of the Holy Spirit and saying, look at this model, because that's the model for all the marriages that are supposed to come after this. Because Adam doesn't have a father and mother to walk away from to cleave to his wife. He just has her. And so that line there in verse 24 is Moses making an inspired commentary and application. Let me say this. This is how the Israelites were supposed to understand marriage. This was, somebody says, well, that's not like a rule. I think it was. I think this was the law that they were supposed to understand when it came to marriage. So in Matthew 5, when Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, whoever divorces his wife, write a certificate of divorce. I think what Jesus is implying here is they missed the law about it. They read this conditional thing over here in Deuteronomy 24, but they missed the rule. And that's why he says, in this, have you not read? Right? And it's interesting, because what did the Pharisees think that they probably were? Probably the law experts, right? And he goes, have you not read? And then he quotes from page 2. And it's like, if you think you're great Bible readers, you haven't even made it to the end of page 2 before Jesus is saying, haven't you read? Like, don't you know what the law is? And so what I think he's saying here is that the instruction right here, that's God's law about it. And I think that's helpful, because we might think of this as just like a narrative. But the Israelites should have gotten their rules from this. When Moses is drawing conclusions, when God is saying something specific, this was where their rules came from. But they overlooked that because they're trying to get to Deuteronomy 24. And we would know why, because there would be an exception there for them. Okay. That's a lot of talking through verse 6. Any questions so far? My only point so far is that Jesus answers their question about divorce with a thesis about marriage, with an argument about marriage, and that marriage was created by God and it's supposed to stick that way. That's the way it's supposed to stay. All right, anything else? Okay, verse 7. They say, well, why did Moses command it? Can we flip back over to Deuteronomy 24 for a second? Deuteronomy 24. So I want you to notice the way this is phrased. If he takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her from his house, is that Moses commanding the man to give a certificate of divorce? No, it is not. In reality, what it's doing is it's saying, if that happens, right? So I used to read this passage and interpret it as Moses isn't okay with divorce, but he's saying if he does, he has to write her a certificate of divorce. I think that's probably true, but he's not even mandating the certificate of divorce part here. He's just saying if it happens that he divorces her and gives her a certificate of divorce, and she goes out and remarries, verse 2, and then that latter husband writes a certificate of divorce, or he dies, verse 4, then the first husband who divorced her, what can he not do? He can't take her back, can't remarry her. Now, here's what I think is happening in Deuteronomy 24. I don't think Moses is commanding divorce. Do you? Do you think? I don't think he's commanding divorce. I don't even think he's saying you have to give her a certificate of divorce, though I think that would be understandable, that would be what ought to be done. The thing he's commanding is if you divorce her and she remarries, that you can't have her back, right? So actually, what God is doing in chapter 24, I take it to be that he is actually, through Moses, trying to slow down the man who's thinking about divorce. I think he's trying to restrain divorce by saying you don't need to do it just, flying off the handle and writing the certificate of divorce, because if she goes, you can't have her back. And I think that the Pharisees misread this. I'm sure most Jewish people misread it. I'm sure that I've misread it before. I think the Pharisees misread it to say what Moses is doing here is showing approval and satisfaction and the appropriateness of divorce as long as that certificate's there. And I don't think that's what Moses is saying at all. I think Moses is saying, I think what we would see, the law is Genesis chapter 2. That's what Moses has to say about divorce. Wouldn't you agree with that? That's the law about it. And Deuteronomy 24 is just the saying of, if he does this, and if she does this, and if this happens to the latter husband, then she can't come back to him. And one reason that I would say that that's the case is because while Moses is writing God's law, does that from Genesis 1 on, I think what he recognizes, what the Lord recognizes, is that they are managing a nation of people. And so what he does is he puts a regulation in place to protect women from just being pawns that are passed back and forth, and keeps it from being a rash decision. Because what we have is Genesis chapter 2, he says they shall become one flesh. Jesus interprets that to mean that what God has joined together, man ought not separate. And Malachi chapter 2 that says God hates divorce. So beginning and end, we have God's will on divorce. And in Deuteronomy 24, we have a if then, don't do this. Does that make sense? It's certainly not Moses. The way they frame it in Matthew 19, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? That's not the command. The command was you don't get to take her back. Now, providing her a certificate of divorce, it was allowed, and Jesus is going to say that, but that's not Moses demanding it, and it's not him. I don't think we would say that Moses is expressing pleasure over the idea of divorce. Any questions about that in verse 7? just about their question. You have anything so far?
No, but I mean, the fact, well, I don't guess it.
No, that's okay. I like that. That's fine.
The fact that they worded their question that way, you can almost go back to where it says they were testing it.
Mhm. Yeah.
We've seen them do this numerous times where they can kind of change the wording or the format of the question, and it's just to test Jesus. It's not to get a real answer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Why are they asking about the exception in Deuteronomy 20, or why are they asking about Moses' instruction? Yeah, I would say they don't feel like he fully answered the question, but I wonder if they're not also trying to pit him against Moses.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is like, it says, is it lawful to divorce a wife for any cause?
Mhm.
He doesn't really answer that.
Right.
Like that question in particular.
Yes.
So I guess I would look at it, and I could almost see in some ways that the emphasis might be more on the why then.
Mm-hmm.
No. It's like, but, Jesus, you didn't understand our question.
Yeah.
Why did Moses command this?
Yeah.
And it's more on what are the reasons that
Yeah.
Moses gave for this?
Yeah, so the way I would understand it, and I may be wrong about this, is if Jesus is saying that divorce shouldn't happen, which I think that's, if we just walked away at verse 6, we would say divorce is not allowed. I think they might be coming back and say, well, if that's the case, why did Moses go to all the trouble in Deuteronomy 24 to write that? And I think Jesus is going to explain that, but you may be very well right. Like, if divorce is not on the table, then why have a conversation about it at all? And Moses does in fact do that in chapter 24. And so, but what I would say is I think it kind of echoes the way Jesus presents it in Matthew 5, is I think he sees them misunderstanding what Moses is doing there. Don't you think? Yeah. Anything else there? Anything through verse 7, anybody? Okay. So verse 8, he says, it was because of your hardness of heart that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Now, I take that to be that the allowance was there, but that was not God's will from eternity. All right? Now, somebody would ask and say, well, what about somebody's soul? Like, where would their soul stand if this was not God's will, but he makes an allowance? I take it to be that a person could stand in a right condition before the Lord and have divorced and remarried for a cause other than the cause of fornication, that they could have broken the bond of being one flesh under the law of Moses and still been in right standing with the Lord. I would take it to be very similar to polygamy, right? Because what was God's will? A man, the two, not the seven, the two shall become one flesh, right? One man walks away from his mother and father and joins to his wife, right? But we see, I would say David is probably one of the primary examples. Abraham would be a primary example, I guess. Solomon doesn't look pleasing to the Lord in that, right? You know what I mean? But I think Abraham does. I think Jacob does. Like, I don't think there's any. Now, I think the scriptures do reiterate over and over and over how well this goes, right? And it's never good. We never see. I mean, it's interesting. You've got Leah and Rachel, and they are competing over who gets married first, and then they're competing. They even name their children based on the competition that they're having about who's having children and who's not. It's a wild situation, right? Never good. Not good with Abraham. But I take it to be that Abraham was still in right standing with the Lord. I take it to be that Jacob was. I take it to be that David was. So all that is to say is this, that I think that God was making allowances, but those were not his desire. And Jesus is saying, from the beginning, it was not supposed to be this way. But there was an allowance because of the hardness of your heart. But now that the covenant is not a deal between God and a nation, like a physical nation, now it's between God and people who will willingly give their lives to him, right? You're not born into this. You get to make a decision about this. Now that rule, what God wanted from the beginning, is the standard, so that we go back to the very beginning And that's the calling for us. And so he would say, from the beginning, it has not been this way. So Jesus in verse 9 is going to clarify precisely what the rule, the standing rule is. Okay. Anything?
The only thing I'd add is that, I can understand their questions because of being in the times, but for us today who look back at these verses and try to okay our lifestyles, how many times did Jesus say in the old days, this is how it's done, but I say, going forward, and this is just another one of them situations where, yes, it was allowed back then, but now going forward under the new covenant, this is how marriage is supposed to be. So that's not an excuse for us today, even though a lot of people will go back to this and say, well, they had multiple wives and they done this and that. Well, they did a lot of things that Jesus says, no, we're no longer doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is a case where Jesus is marking a transition from what was allowed under the old law to what's... Now, I would say this, that if a person really wanted to be shaped by the law, I think they would have committed to one man for one woman for life. But even people like David, who the Psalms reflect as somebody who meditated on the law of the Lord, didn't do what he would have been called to do here. But I think there's a transition here that is calling to that.
Can I ask you just real quick? I don't want to get off on
That's okay. We got time, I think.
At this time, it would not have been a practice to have multiple wives, right?
I doubt it.
Didn't like the Romans or the Greeks kind of
Do away with that. Yeah. Now I say that the Romans and the Greeks had a lot of extramarital things that were allowed, but I don't know about their policy of having one wife.
I don't know. You just don't read about that much.
No, you're right about that. I can't think of any examples in the New Testament, best I know.
I was just trying to think if there's a reason.
And I don't know what the latest example that we read of in the Old Testament. I'm trying to think of somebody after Solomon. I'm sure some of those other kings would have had multiple wives, but a lot of those would have been like royal treaty kind of marriages and not necessarily love marriages. But I don't know. That's a good question. I would say probably not very common at the time. I think probably in the Middle East, polygamous marriages arose more with Islam than it was with Judaism. Islam early on, I don't know what it's like today, but early on encouraged polygamous marriages. And so that may have led to a rise in that. Okay, so anything through verse 8? All right, chapter 19, verse 9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for the cause of sexual immorality, your text may say fornication, and marries another woman, commits adultery. So Luke 16:18, we already looked at that. I think it's helpful to understand this. What does Jesus say is the rule about divorce? If we just had to summarize in one word, what would Jesus say about divorce? No, right? That's Jesus' rule about divorce. What then would we say about divorce and remarriage? What would the rule be about that? No, the divorce wasn't right in the first place, so the remarriage ain't going to be right in the second place. But he gives the one exception here. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. Like when we're talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, I don't want our inclination to be, well, what's the exception? I want us to focus on the rule, right? Especially when we're talking to our young folks who are thinking about getting married. Like, remember, it's only for the cause of one. I just want them to say, you're getting married and you're staying that way, right? You're stuck, right? In the best way possible. It's a pleasure, okay? So, but I think that's a good way, like, you're just in it, right? And there's no choice otherwise, right? No bailing out. That's the rule. And divorce with remarriage, I think Jesus would portray, especially in Luke 16:18, where he doesn't mention the exception. He says, you divorce your wife and you marry somebody else, you've committed adultery, period, right? That's all he says in Luke 16. But then we come to the exception. And when I say the exception, I think that definite article is important. The exception, except for the cause of fornication. Does anybody have a text that says immorality? Not sexual immorality, just immorality? I can't. What translation do you have? New American. And it just says immorality? Yeah. I love the New American Standard. That is bad, right? It's not just immorality, all right? Mine says sexual immorality, and I don't think that's enough, right? I think the old King James word fornication, I think, really gets at the idea of it, because it is the idea of intercourse between two people who don't have a right to that. And that concept there is the exception for divorce that would then allow remarriage on the other side. So I would say it's the thing that justifies a divorce, and it's the thing that justifies being able to remarry after that. So when I was growing up, this is the way that I heard it phrased by preachers. In every case of divorce, there is sin involved. In every case of divorce, there's sin involved. Either it's the sin of the divorce itself, or it's the sin of the person who was unfaithful to their commitment in sexual immorality, right? Now, that doesn't mean that both people are sinning, right? Somebody might be the innocent party in that. But in every case of divorce, there is sin involved. Either the sin of the one who's doing the putting away, or the sin of the infraction to the covenant. So, all that is to say is that makes this a very serious matter indeed. And especially when we look on the other side of that, where we talk about remarriage, which then I think locks somebody into a sin that continues, right? Whereas a divorce, I think it's wrong, but somebody could turn away from that and just remain on their own. When you remarry, then you're locked into a situation where that sin is continuing to persist. Does that make sense? I hope that's clear. All right. Anything else that you have?
I've got 2 points, but they may be questions.
Okay.
So you may have to answer.
Okay. You didn't text me before, so.
I did not text you before. So the individual who commits adultery, fornication, does not have the right to remarry.
I agree with that.
Okay. And then I forgot my other point.
So let me
So
say.
the other point is, if you divorce for a reason not because of this, and the fornication falls later on, that's still not a...
Correct. Like if the divorce is done, right, and then down the road,
one commits adultery.
you
can't justify that by coming back and saying, well,
Yeah. So that was called mental divorce, was the argument that was made by some brethren. Other people, but by some brethren as well.
I probably should have texted you that.
No, that's okay. So if my best understanding is, let's say Lydia leaves me because I burned the beans, right? And what happens is down the road, she divorced me because I burned the beans. But 5 years later, she finds out that I'm shacked up with somebody. Then she could say, now I'm really putting him away for the cause of fornication. Or maybe it would be the reverse. Maybe if I put her away and then she finds out. You see what I'm saying? And then that way she could read back onto the situation and say, okay, now's when the separation really occurs. And what I would say in that is that the scriptures don't make that distinction between a divorce here and then the putting away later. Now, I will say this, that there is a difference between somebody being married and somebody being bound. Does that make sense? So if Lydia and I hate to use this example. I don't even like talking about it. Okay, I got to think of names. If Jeremiah and the bullfrog, if Jeremiah and Jennifer, right, are married, and he puts her away, they're not married, but they're still bound. Does that make sense? They are still committed to each other. If, however, she's unfaithful and he puts her away, I believe that both the marriage and the bond are broken so that he's free to remarry. But she would not be, right? Because she had been put away because of her fornication. So all that is to say is when that divorce happens, the marriage is broken. The bond is not broken. But that doesn't mean that his later on remarrying or something like that allows her to like retroactively look back on that. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. We can do more on that later if somebody else has a question. Did you have another question? That was it?
I'm done. Okay.
Now, can I address something right quick? And then we'll go to the last few verses. Recently, I think he's pretty famous among brethren. Excuse me. It's pretty famous among brethren and he and his wife counsel people in marriages, which I think is a train wreck. So if somebody recommends them to you, I can't tell you who they are unless you ask me, and then I'll tell you. But they argued that the sexual immorality there would include something like pornography, and that would be a justification to put a husband away or a wife away. Now, I think pornography is horrible, awful, and it has wrecked our society. And I'll say more about that later on probably. But this does not include that as an exception for divorce and remarriage. And the reason, what they argued is that translation of the word fornication, sexual immorality, or immorality, right? It's translated all those different ways. The word is porneia, Porneia in our writing. And because the word porneia, because you can see that word in our word pornography, they said, well, that must be an exception. We got the word pornography from the Greek word for fornication, right? Porneia. But that means fornication, right? Graphy, right? It's not talking about, pornography is not talking about the act, and porneia is not talking about the pictures. It's talking about the act itself. So all of that is to say is we have to be very careful, because I've had people call me and say, so-and-so is married to so-and-so and they want out of the marriage and this is what he's doing. And I don't think that's an exception for divorce and remarriage. It's horrible. He or she needs to get help, and we need to address that as clearly and as thoroughly as possible. But I don't think that's what this word is talking about. And then other brethren have worked in other exceptions from passages like 1 Corinthians 7, and I don't think those exceptions are there either. I think basically what 1 Corinthians 7 is saying is that if you're going to be faithful to the Lord and your spouse is going to leave you for that, so be it. You don't have to chase them, but I don't think it gives you the right to remarry when they leave either. And I know that seems heartbreaking, because it would leave someone who is innocent in all of those ways, faithful to the Lord in all those ways, in a position where they couldn't remarry. And I would say the Lord knows that you're innocent in that, but that doesn't break the instructions that we're given with regards to what the exceptions are. And I know that's challenging, but that is in fact, I think, what the scriptures teach about that. Because if you're put away for something other than the cause of fornication, even if you are, innocent in all of that, then you in fact would be not able to remarry because of what Matthew 19:9 says. Okay. Any other thoughts through verse 9? I have an answer. You go first. No, it's okay. I may answer it later. So.
Okay. So when Jesus is making this new rule, is this for current, right now, his lifetime, or is it for the new covenant?
I would say it's for the new. I would say when Jesus teaches this, his disciples needed to follow it immediately. I don't know what it would mean for people who haven't heard Jesus speak yet and are still living under basically what they understood. But I think for the most part, Jesus is saying, if you're going to be my disciple, if you're going to live under my reign, this is what it would take. And I think that's just reinforced when we come into the New Testament. I think passages like Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians 7 would show that's what applies now. 1 Corinthians 7 is helpful because Paul will quote what Jesus says here. And it's helpful because if you took what Jesus says here, think about with regards to Ezra. Remember, he had all of the men divorce their wives if they were married to somebody who was a foreigner. And I think 1 Corinthians 7, I think it's people wondering if they were supposed to do that kind of thing, which is kind of interesting, right? So maybe I shouldn't have said that's the only thing that's said about divorce, because they were supposed to put away their idolatrous wives. And I think the people in 1 Corinthians 7 are asking about that. And Paul says, no, if they stay with you, you stay with them. It's if they leave that you don't have to go with them. Does that make sense? So I think he's clarifying it there. All right, let me just mention verses 10 through 12 real quick. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. So we say, well, he didn't understand how hard it was. They did, right? They got it. They understood. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement. What statement? That it's better not to marry. Not everybody can handle that. but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He is able to accept this, let him accept it. I think this is what Jesus is saying. I think he is saying, they say, what? That's the rule? And he's saying, yes. And I think this is Jesus saying, if you're going to be my disciple, you better count the cost. Right? Now, some people are born eunuchs. That is, people who are not going to marry, and they're just born in that state. They're just not interested in pursuing that. Then there are people who are made eunuchs for the sake of men. I think about probably like the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Who is a treasurer to the queen, and very often in royal situations, they would make that man a eunuch so that there was no danger between him and the queen, right? Nothing could be taken advantage of. And then there are some men who are eunuchs because of the kingdom's sake. And I think in that case is because men see that they can't live up to that, one man, one woman for life, or potentially because they find themselves in a condition where they're not allowed to be remarried. And Jesus says, you might have to be a eunuch for the kingdom's sake. And that's a challenging call. But notice what Jesus says. Let him who can accept this accept it. If you want to be my disciple, if that's the level to which you're committed to me, if you can handle that, that's the rule. So he responds to their, we can't believe that, we can't handle that, with something really strong and says, take up your cross and follow me. I think is what he's saying. Paul would fall into that category. I believe you're exactly right. And maybe Barnabas as well. Yes, sir. About the what? Okay, yes. Yes. Yeah, that's what I would take. That's what how I would take it. That's right. Okay. Thank y'all very much for your participation.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact